I'll ask one last question and then we'll open it up to everybody here. Um, I'm glad you brought up Delhi in December last year. I thought was really interesting that happened there was basically politics being lived on the street that also then led to certain changes in the law as it existed. And so much about queer politics in India has had to do with questions of the law. Now, what are for me personally, I think the law is a great way. The knowledge of the law is a great resource to have. You know, when you're confronted with just all kinds of oppressions, and the law is a great resource to have. But could you, both of you also, and you as a legal practitioner, also think about what the limitations of the law are, what the limitations the law brings are, and what are the different forms, what are the different institutions that you'd like to see queer politics engage with in the future, if it's not just the law?
No, I think this question of the law comes up again and again. It's addressed in the book, and we still have to think and talk about what the law means. I think there's many ways one can answer this question. One opinion, of course, is that the law is straightforward linked to violence, and the law is straightforward problematic. So, I mean, no progressive person should have anything to do with the law. And that's an opinion which I think makes a lot of sense in many ways as well. It's not something you completely discount. But I think the point I want to stress is that there are many ways or many kinds of law one needs to think about. I mean, more philosophically as the way we think about the law. One is the law is linked to violence, but others can think of the law differently. And I would just want to just talk about one small story for a little bit, which is the founding myth of the origin of law, which is the story of Antigone in Greek philosophy, in Greek theater, where the idea of Antigone is really the fact that she's told by Creon that you can't bury your brother. That's the king's law. That's the law which says you can't bury your brother. Antigone says, I will bury my brother. And she says, I will bury my brother because I will not obey a man-made law. I obey a higher law. That's the point she makes. So the point I really want to ask is when we talk about the law, what is the higher law one is referring to? 377 is the lower law. We're talking about a higher law, which is what inspires or moves me at least when we think of the law. If you look at the history of the idea of dignity, I'll link it back to two people as far as India is concerned, which is both Mahatma Gandhi as well as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And if you look at Ambedkar's story, his entire life was a struggle against practices of indignity and humiliation. There's one particularly moving story where he talks about the fact that as a child, when he was in school, when he goes to school, the teacher will throw him a gunny sack and say, you sit on the gunny sack. And that's the experience of indignity from which he comes. And that's why the notion of dignity is so important and powerful as far as the Indian Constitution is concerned. And similarly, if you look at the story of Gandhi and you look at my experiments with truth, I mean, it's really, once again, the story of being thrown off the railway station is something we all know. But after he was thrown off the railway station, what the autobiography, what he says, is then he got onto a coach, to take the journey forward. And the people, the owner of the coach told him, you can get into the coach, but you sit in the front out there, where the coachman sits. And then you pay the entire fare and you can carry on that way. So he goes and sits there, and he's sitting there, the guy from inside comes out and says, I want to smoke. Hey Sammy, which is Swami, which is a derogatory term for Tamilians. And then says, hey Sammy, sit on this gunny sack, and throws him another gunny sack. Gandhi says, I will not go. He just holds on to that for dear life as he's getting beaten. But once again, what illustrates it is how important the notion of dignity is. And so really what I think the queer movement has done is reclaim the idea of dignity for ourselves. And the Delhi High Court judgment is a marvelous illustration of how the idea of dignity, which is so intrinsic to the idea of who it means to be, within this context, Indian, applies as equally to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender person. So, I mean, that's really the notion of law, the idea of law, which I would defend and say that's the idea of law which we need to protect and take forward. And so we critique the notion of the law such as 377 on the basis of what we would call, in some sense, a higher law. And the higher law, once again, I don't want to put it in the frames of Article 21 because there's lots of points. When Article 21, which is the right to life, actually goes against the interests of a large majority of people. Yeah. But the notion of dignity, which is there in Article 21 or which can be read in Article 21, is something we will defend and we will work with.
I mean, I'll just add one line. I think that there's a difference between decriminalization and the law as a space for acceptance and inclusion. So I think for it to be a criminal offense, right, was one argument that I think where there was a necessity in which it actively prevented life. Would I go back after the 377 judgment through a legal route for other kinds of inclusion within the law? I'm not sure. And I think for me that distinction is an important one because there is a history of the women's movement's engagements with the law. There is a history of going to the court on dowry, on sex-selective abortion, on sexual violence, on rape. And I was involved personally as part of many, many groups in the campaigns on the new criminal violence laws, right? And lobbying around those violence laws. And there is a way in which I agree very much with Arvind's notion of dignity. I'm not certain you find dignity as often in the courts as you would like. And I think there is a way, partly is because, I was in the courts on 377 while the same courts were ordering slum evictions in cities where I worked as a housing rights activist. And so for me, the court was both this space of tremendous joy and tremendous anger. And those two experiences have never separated from each other, And so I think that for me, I think that 377 at that point was a strategic choice. I don't think we could have fought any other battle. I don't think we went because the law is an easier battle to fight than a public campaign. It's easier a battle to fight than a public campaign when you have 6 square people you can count who will go on TV, who will use their full names, who are out to their parents, who can step out. And I don't think it was possible. I mean, I think that, to me, the history of deciding to go to court, which was never a single moment decision. It was also like, movements don't have plans. They just happen. They happen to you, you happen to them. But to decide to back the case was very much a fact saying, look, this is as good a fight as any. It's only one fight. We kept saying time and time again that we don't believe that winning will end homophobia. We don't believe that the law, the piece I wrote in the book is called The Limits of the Law. But it's an important fight. I don't think you should put a hierarchy of griefs, and I don't think you should put a hierarchy of strategies. I think you put them next to each other, and the battle we fought was in the court. But it's only one of many battles that have to be fought, and there are many things it will not fix and will not solve and will not touch, but that's fine. Because there is nothing that will touch all of them. There are no silver bullets. There are no single, there's no, if you press this button instead of that one, you'll get all this impact and solve it all. Everything is partial and fragmented. It's like that scene in Ship of Theseus, that last movie when the guy comes back, and if you see the movie, he comes back to his grandmother.
Give out the story, Gautam.
It's a good line. So it's a thing, and she says in the end something wonderful, and he's like, oh, I tried to do this political activist thing, I tried to make change, and she smiled at him and she said, it was a very bad English translation, very annoying. She said in Hindi, she said, itna hi milta hai. And they translate it as this is as good as it gets, which is not what she said. She said, this is how much you get. Itna hi milta hai. And I always thought of the law as that, as never big capital L, powerful institution of authority. I saw it as one more akhada to have a fight in, and it was a fight worth fighting.
Thank you. Before I hand it over to the audience, there is a Yoda desk behind you. This book is part of a series on sexualities that Gautam has edited, that Yoda came out with, and there will be, I'm sure, other Yoda books out there. But I'm throwing it out to the audience now. Any questions, comments, clarifications?
Hi. I have like a couple
Introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Gautaman. I'm a lawyer. I work with ALF. And when we speak about this whole new generation, old generation thing, I find myself like stuck in between, I think, right now. Because I came into queer politics reading queer and because I have voice and everything, and imagined or expected that queer inherently is liberating, and then, it's intersectional and all that. And then I look back at the reality around me and I'm like, okay. So for me, what is really important is to kind of contextualize a book like this to the current day situation. And I think when I say current day situation, I want to be a little more explicit because you log on to Planet Romeo and you have these profiles that says no oldies, worldies, girlies, FMEs, and whatnot, like, like, and then that kind of like epitomizes all kinds of bigotry. And then I'm like, and and this is something I mean, you can't, like, how do I say that you cannot be casteist and gay, you cannot be classist and gay, without having this position of like, okay, like your queer politics is different from mine. No, I want to say that these are connected injustices that we are fighting, and if you cannot see the larger picture, then you are terribly wrong. And that is where I find the importance of a book like this in the current day context a lot more, like really immediate. So yeah, it's just one reflection. But then, if how do we even engage with the kind of groups that are coming up, multiple Facebook groups, celebration of marriages, and like, I don't even know where to start with, like, and how do I engage with, like, re-release of book because I have a voice, maybe.
A third edition, do we want that?
I mean, I think it's a tough question, and I think the thing to think about it is that it's not a question you just asked in sexuality movements. It's a question that labor movements ask. It's a question that movements around religion ask. It's a question that development movements ask. It's a question of how. But I think that you have to the only thing I can say is that what's clear to me now is that this moment is not like that moment. That's all. And it takes a while for that to happen, which means we have to start understanding this moment, which means actually this shouldn't be your reference. Because even if it feels current, it's because it's holding you back, is what I would say. Because I think what's necessary at any political moment is to understand what are the logics by which silencing happens now. What are the logics by which connections are broken now? Right? The way we were silenced in 2000 is not the way the silence happens now. Now you have a different kind of appropriation. Right? Now you have a different kind of, people will not, in many cases, people will not openly be homophobic to your face. Right? Now you actually have these very strange interconnected oppressions where gay people feel free to be sexist towards effeminate gay men. Now you will have the complete divorce of the mixed spaces where actually queer women, trans people, and gay men actually come together. But I think that those, and then those spaces are, so I think that the challenges are to look at this moment on its own terms. To actually figure out and say, if it's not that you're not seeing these connections, it's to look back and say, what do the connections look like now? Actually, maybe we're not seeing the connections. Maybe the connections don't look like that anymore. And maybe the way in which caste functions with sexuality is actually very different than it did when we were having. Maybe that's the problem. So maybe the disjuncts are, and that's why I sort of hesitate to say something about the new generation, because actually at some point, I don't feel like I read this moment anymore, right? So I don't feel like I could do a book now. So I mean, I would say exactly the same thing as Arvind. Not just because I think new people should do it, because I don't have an instinctive sense that I can read the moment, and which is great because time passes and this thing goes. So I think the way I would think about it right now is to really, because there are people who get the connections and start there, and the one thing that I think that I've always realized is that it may not be the people who you expect to get it. So look in unexpected places. You may actually find it far away from queerness and LGBTness and queer people, far away. You may find it in a totally different space, in a construction workers union, which actually instantly gets it. And maybe we made this connection via sexuality, because at that moment, other movements use sexuality to question themselves. This is not that moment. Sexuality has become something else, which means now maybe we need to look at work. Maybe we need to look at labor. Maybe we need to look at religion. Maybe it's looking at Muzaffarnagar and Khap Panchayats and will allow us to come up with a progressive intersectional politics, because there's no reason why the intersectional politics has to come from sexuality. Let it come from somewhere else. And I think that means we have to start looking somewhere else.
Well, just one small point to that is I think taking on Gautam's point, the number of figures, even in contemporary times, who embody certain kind of intersectional politics. Just that we haven't really looked closely enough, I think. And the figure to me who is really, really remarkable is Chelsea Manning. What a remarkable story. You hear this person who's born Bradley Manning, and then she does something remarkable. she exposes the entire record as far as the US military is concerned, for which she gets 27 years in jail. 27 years. And she's there for almost 2 years, I think, in solitary confinement for 23 or 24 hours. And what is her motivation? And you read her statement, it's really remarkable. She says, when I see those Iraqis, the way she sees it, they're human beings, much like I am. And here's a person who in the rest of the United States doesn't see the Iraqis as human beings. Here's this person who sees Iraqis as human beings. And you can possibly draw a connection between that and her being transgender, because the remarkable thing she does is she does this act, and the day she's convicted, she comes out with the other things. She says, actually, I'm Chelsea Manning. Please call me Chelsea from now on. So she does these two remarkable acts of truth-telling. She talks about who she is, and she talks about people other than her who are as important as she is. And you think of that as a culture which is so blind. The US, who is talking about anybody, the Iraqis, other than, and this remarkable way where she's putting her life at risk, other than Chelsea Manning. So, I mean, there are these figures. I just don't think we've looked hard enough at this one.
I have my own struggle with this book, reading in bus in Bombay with a rainbow flag on it and people staring at you.
Sorry. Is this better?
So it was really tough to read and go around. But what you said, I think one thing which was a recent realization watching a black standing by the conservatives in US and looking at from that side to looking at Hindutva activists being queer and being a part of the system is the reflection of somewhere inclusivity. But it may not be at a larger level, but it is somewhere sort of coming to the idea and accepting that you are on the side of the right and is also not wrong. So I think that's something, whether it is one of the things which in the movies gaze for socialism, I think that's done. We are done with that stage. So that's something. There is a next level of looking at where we are probably having Ramdev around. So which is not possible, but surely can something come into that picture. So that was some sort of comment on that. And I don't know, there were certain portions of the book which I think I have a deja vu, saying that I saw it in the movie or in certain movies, but not as a whole. But it is still not collected as a part, the way the two suicides have been committed, and then there's this guy who meets for one night. I don't remember which movie was it, but it was there in the cinema, but it's just not the way it didn't come out, the way it should have been.
Yeah, I agree.